And we're now coming to that important time to introduce our guest speaker. Our guest speaker is Mr. Andrew Munden, the Operations Director for Chiltern Railways. Andrew actually brings to us today something which I personally believe is very important as we look forward in the industry, and that is experience on both sides of the industry that we now manage. He is now, of course, a leading operator as Director of Operations of one of our very successful train operating companies. But he has spent quite a lot of his career as well previously with Network Rail. So he's very familiar with what goes on the other side of the fence, as it were, in terms of the new industry structure. I think it's very important we think about that, and Andrew has got some important messages for us in that context. So will you please give a very big golden whistles welcome to Mr. Andrew Munden. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I apologise in advance. I've had a bit of a dodgy throat for the last week or so this is not me trying to impersonate George Clooney and be terribly husky. It's now 34 years since I joined the then Chief Civil Engineers Department of British Rail's Southern Region down in Croydon. And this invitation to speak to you today led me to stop and reflect on some of the changes that have occurred in that time, particularly in the world of operations. Organisations such as the London and South East sector, Network South East, the business-led divisions, Railtrack, OPRAF and the Strategic Rail Authority have all come and gone in that time. And yet the trains still run on time, and they are far busier. And more importantly, we run a far safer network than when I first joined the railway. The year that I joined British Rail, there were 27 staff fatalities, and no one really thought that was anything exceptional. My early career was actually spent with the civil engineers and included some extremely happy years in the Divisional Civil Engineers Office of what was then the South Western Division down at Wimbledon. Interestingly, one of the most challenging jobs that I ever had to become involved with in all that time was not actually a major bridge reconstruction or indeed a big station reconstruction, but rather it was the challenge set by Chris Green, who was coming in as the incoming director of what was to become Network South East. And when he took one look at Waterloo Station, he issued the edict that he wanted a new office fit for a director, and he gave us 72 hours to do it. Some of you might remember, if you're of a certain age, the programme on television Challenge Annika. Well, we did it too, just without the 1980s Lycra. So in 1993, I was given the opportunity to become part of the team preparing the railway for privatisation. And it ended with me joining what became the South West Division of Railtrack. Up until that point, people in the industry had the benefit of the really, really excellent BR training schemes to give a wide knowledge of how the integrated railway worked. But of course all that ended on the 1st of April 1994. Since then we've bred a generation of railway men and women who by and large only have experience of running track or trains, but not both. While I worked at Railtrack and latterly at Network Rail, I was fortunate enough to look after the southern departmental fleet of vehicles that brought me into close contact with the three train operators south of the river, who in those days operated the large fleet of sandite and de-icing trains on our behalf. And I suppose it was probably this that awoke in me the desire to become more involved with the operational railway. Back in 1999, I made what was undoubtedly the best career move of my life, part obviously from joining Chiltern, and I was offered the chance to jump the divide and become an operator on what was then the Sussex area of rail track. Until privatisation, of course, this would have been a really difficult thing to do. One climbed a ladder, one stayed within a function, and in those days it was not easy to transfer between functions. Engineers were engineers, and operators were operators. In 2004, I became the first Network Rail route director for Sussex, initially running Sussex and then Kent, as some of you will remember, and latterly I ran the Anglia route over a period of 7 years. And while I was in Anglia, I was the Network Rail lead point of contact for 16 passenger and freight operators. All of them had very differing business needs, ranging from London Overground with their Transport for London awarded concession, to National Express with their more traditional franchises in C2C and East Anglia. And then the commercially driven operators such as Freightliner, both intermodal and heavy haul, and GB Rail Freight. By the time I left Anglia, we were running 4,400 trains a day, which I think is no small challenge. And as such, I was in daily contact with those operators' senior management teams and managing directors. I have to say, in the case of Laurel, this was far too close a contact and far too frequent for comfort until we started a poor performance round on the North London line. And I prided myself on understanding their needs and what they wanted. Some of you might actually remember the snappily titled Network Rail initiative around this time called What Makes a TOC Tick, which was rolled out to all the route teams right across the country in an attempt to increase the level of understanding and responsiveness to customers' needs. I always felt, though, that something was missing for me. I guess the best analogy that I can come up with is that of a child who's given a train set for either birthday or Christmas. They open the box with much excitement on the living room floor in the morning, only to discover that although the box contains the track, the signals, the trains, and probably a power controller, no one's included the trains. If they want to play trains, they have to go and find one of their friends down the road, whose box probably contained the trains, but not the track, the signals, the stations, or the power controller. And of course, as we all know, this friendship can get quite strained if the train then comes off the track and gets scratched or broken. Back in 2011, I was given the opportunity to join Chiltern Railways. And I have to say, much to my undying embarrassment, I'd only sat at my new desk at Marylebone for a matter of days before the horrible realisation hit me that in fact I really hadn't the faintest idea how this particular TOC ticked. I mean, it's just as we heard this morning in the conference, Network Rail and operators are driven by very, very different commercial priorities and regulators. I was lucky. My new colleagues at Chiltern were very understanding and very tolerant of this new interloper and helped me up to speed very, very quickly. Having for many years managed signallers, mobile operations managers and other frontline staff, I found it particularly interesting to move into the driving cab to compare and contrast what went on. And I like to think that one thing that I brought quite quickly to Chiltern was an understanding of why Network Rail behaves in certain ways, which can at times appear irrational both to management and to drivers alike. Since then, we've spent a lot of time developing a close collaboration with Network Rail, based on a mutual understanding of each other's business needs, of which more later. When I joined the railway, there was a very clear structure of professional organisations providing leadership to the different functions, ranging from the institutions of civil, mechanical and electrical and signal engineers, to the Permanent Way Institution for track. So if any of you are wondering what PWI meant, it's that. But there was nothing for operators. And I think operators were regarded with some suspicion by just about all the different engineering functions, and I'm sure were not considered professional in the least by any of these long-established bodies. It was therefore long overdue when the Institution of Railway Operators was formed back in 2000 to raise the standards through operational training, the sharing of knowledge and best practice, and to represent operators at all levels throughout the industry. It's really, really good to see how the institution has developed in that time, with even full chartered status now being on the cards. Certainly for me, one in the eye then for the concrete farmers and grease monkeys amongst you. As the network gets busier and more congested, we increasingly rely upon split-second, highly professional operation, just as much as we rely upon the trains, the track and the signals. But I believe there's still a lot more that can be done to bring together the operational skills of track and trains. Network Rail made a good start a few years ago by establishing the Track and Train Graduate Scheme, but we should surely pause to consider exactly how many senior managers at the top of the industry today have hands-on experience of running track and trains, let alone the next generation who will succeed us in not many years' time. I sat down the other day and did a quick fag packet calculation, and I could think of no more than 30 people at the top of the industry today who've done that. We must do more to encourage the exchange of emerging talent between Network Rail and the operators if we're to fulfil the aims that are set out by the institution. So, what about Chiltern? There's a nice picture of it there. A view commonly held by the industry and by some stakeholders is that we're similar to C2C or Merseyrail in being largely a self-contained network which gives rise to a high level of performance. The Chiltern network covers 222 route miles, so we're small but perfectly formed. We operate a mix of London suburban, long-distance mainline and rural services, and yet, contrary to popular belief, we share every single mile with other passenger and freight operators. Even the route between Marylebone and Aynhoe Junction to the south of Banbury, which has been traditionally considered as our territory, is shared these days with an increasing number of freight services, mostly running to the landfill site at Calvert on the former Great Central London extension north of Aylesbury. These all have to be pathed across the increasingly congested single-track branch from Princes Risborough to Aylesbury, home incidentally to the oldest passenger trains now outside the Isle of Wight. And they have to dovetail into the Chiltern 100-mile-an-hour timetable south of Risborough. When I moved to Anglia in 2009 as route director, it struck me that the North London line lacked real operational focus and was very much the poor relation to the Great Eastern and the West Anglia main lines. Any large incident on either of those generally meant that the North London line received very little attention. At the time, Laurel was struggling to raise PPM to the level required by TfL, and I therefore created the post of area manager to focus solely on North London and Thameside. So later re-signalling on the route transferred the control to Upminster IECC, hence the synergy, although I'm sure that Julian would particularly agree this undoubtedly helped C2C too. From that time, Laurel's PPM began its inexorable upward march to the level that we see today. And upon arriving at Marylebone, it immediately struck me that a similar situation existed in terms of focus, especially on the increasingly busy Cherwell Valley section from Aynhoe Junction north to Leamington Spa and through the congested Snow Hill corridor in Birmingham. I discussed this with Jo Kay, who was at the time the route managing director, and she generously agreed that we could trial a similar solution, which led to the appointment of John Salmon as area manager for the Snow Hill lines, although in practice, John looks after the entire route from the LNW boundary at Droitwich Spa right through to Marylebone. And I'm pleased to say this focus has generated exactly the same results as it did in North London. And the relationship that's developed between the route team and Chiltern has laid the foundations for the collaboration agreement that you'll have read about in the December edition of Modern Railways. Successful performance improvement groups exist, attended by Chiltern and London Midland, for both the Snow Hill and the Chiltern routes, which has led to some significant performance improvements in the Snow Hill corridor. Between us, we've solved performance problems using the pooled expertise of our performance and timetabling teams. Only by working closely together can we make this increasingly busy part of the network run well. The motto of the Great Central, as I'm sure some of you will know, was forward. And in keeping with that, we'll open in September the 6th to be precise, the first section of the new route from London to Oxford via a chord at Bicester, linking the Chiltern main line to the east-west route. This will be the first new main line linking two English cities for over 100 years, and appropriately, the Great Central was the last. Initially, services will run to the new Oxford Parkway station on the northern outskirts of the city, adjacent to the existing park and ride facility. And services will extend through to Oxford in 2016, once work has been completed at Wolvercote Tunnel and the new bay platforms are ready at Oxford. So as quick as you can, please, Patrick. The new timetable will see 10% more trains running compared to today, which is an increase of 18% against the timetable in operation before the first phase of Evergreen 3 was commissioned in September 2011. With the MAA climbing 2% in the period and a right time MAA of 85.6% at the end of last period, I think this demonstrates that in fact a busier network need not necessarily lead to lower levels of performance. To enable this change, our driver establishment has increased by 9% since 2011, and we'll have 14 more trains, plus the new Class 68 locomotives, which are currently in driver training in preparation for taking over from the existing Class 67 fleet in March. All of this will mean dovetailing together two mainline services from the West Midlands and from Oxford, ensuring that both perform to a consistently high level. And that's even before we start to consider the implications of HS2 construction traffic running to Calvert, or the next stage of east-west services via Aylesbury to Milton Keynes. There's one other very important relationship that I've not yet mentioned, and that's the one we have with London Underground. The Great Central London extension from the start shared the tracks of the Metropolitan Railway between Quainton Road in Buckinghamshire and Finchley Road on the approaches to Marylebone. Subsequent changes over the years mean that we now share the tracks between Amersham and Harrow-on-the-Hill, which is a distance of about 15 miles. And this is a truly unique arrangement in this country. Elsewhere, London Underground operate over Network Rail infrastructure, whereas our drivers have to work in accordance with the London Underground rulebook, and our trains have to be fitted with tripcocks to interface with the London Underground signalling system. Any delays on the Met can quickly affect other services out of Marylebone, and so London Underground contribute fully to the Chiltern performance strategy in exactly the same way as we and Network Rail do. So what are the key points for me? Well, it's all about having an inherently reliable infrastructure in the first place. The Saltley Maintenance Delivery Unit has consistently been one of the best performers in the country, with a very, very low level of maintenance backlog for well over a year now. It's all about having a timetable plan that's robust and is constantly refined with input from all the operators on the route. I would argue that a good plan develops a good rhythm of delivery. It's all about unremitting focus on operational delivery by Network Rail and ourselves. It's all about working really closely with other operators on those shared sections of route. Good examples being the recent amendment to a London Midlands set of empties at Birmingham New Street, which is not even on our route, which has in turn reduced the risk of a delayed cross-country service, impacting on our key AM peak up services at Leamington Spa, or indeed the retiming of a Freightliner service, which was regularly causing delay to our key West Midlands peak services in the Leamington area. Close working between operators and Network Rail undoubtedly brings real results, but I guess you don't need me to tell you that, do you? So, to sum up then, we must never underestimate the importance of professionalism among railway operators, and it's beholden on all of us to foster and develop that. I believe that it's critical that as an industry we address the current track and train skill gap through education, training and the joint development of resources. And lastly, we must never lose sight of the benefits of local managers such as John Salmon, who closely recognise the specific needs of operators sharing common lines of route. The IRO has a responsibility to foster and grow this professionalism, as it has capably demonstrated over the last 15 years, and it is without a doubt best placed to facilitate the cross-industry development of our resources. And I, for one, look forward to being part of that development. Thank you.